Helen, it doesn't matter who it is, just someone.
Maybe two.
Sean, I'm going to sit next to you. Yep.
I might just give them a 2-minute warning. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats, we will be starting in 2 minutes' time. So if you'd like to find your seats, we'll be starting in 2 minutes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Canberra Networking Day 2018. We do have more delegates that are stuck in security clearance downstairs, but they'll come in as we start this morning. My name is Helen Sovchuk. I'm the National CEO of the Australia-China Business Council. Just a few housekeeping matters for me before I pass on to our President, John Brumby. If you'd please like to take your seats, and firstly, could you please ask all of you to switch off your mobile phones or to turn them to silent. Bathrooms are located upstairs at the back of the room. Morning tea, lunch and afternoon tea will be served in the mural hall, which is upstairs and to the back. Staff here will be able to direct you. Now, also, we have a very tight schedule for today, so I please ask you to promptly return to your seats at the end of every session. Also, very importantly, at the end of the day, we are being hosted by the Chinese Embassy for a cocktail reception at 5 o'clock. You must wear your lanyards for entry to the embassy function tonight. So please wear your lanyards. We are in a private section of Parliament House, so you must wear your lanyards for identification purposes. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the National President of the Australia-China Business Council, who will be our moderator for today, and our MC, the Honourable John Brumby.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Helen and to her team. There's a huge amount of organisation that goes into Canberra Networking Day. So, Helen, just in case I forget to say it later, thank you to you and your team for the great job you've done, and this program as well. Great program, and we'll, as Helen said, we will move through today and try and keep on time and on schedule. Can I begin my remarks today by acknowledging traditional owners and paying my respects to elders past and present. So on behalf of the Australia-China Business Council, can I welcome you all to Canberra Networking Day. May I particularly acknowledge our distinguished guests who will be joining us throughout the day. The Prime Minister, who will be with us this afternoon, the Chinese Ambassador, who I will be introducing in just a few minutes' time, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Minister for Trade, for Tourism and Investment, the Shadow Treasurer, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and the Shadow Minister for Trade and Investment. And can I welcome and acknowledge also our fellow ACBC ACBC board members from across Australia. We do appreciate that this is an extremely busy time in Parliament, and so the efforts of our distinguished guests, our parliamentary leaders, in being here today, again, I think highlights the real importance that they place on the Australia-China relationship. So thank you to all of our distinguished guests once again. So Canberra Networking Day. I think Canberra Networking Day really sums up what the Australia-China Business Council is all about. We talk to business, we talk to government, we help business talk to government, and we help Australia talk to China. And there's never been a more important time to be talking than right now. For most of the years that I've been involved with the Australia-China Business Council, I've seen an Australia-China relationship which has been in great shape. Strong business links, strong people-to-people links, and a strong and mutually respectful relationship at government level. Last year, the business and people relationship remained strong and positive. But we did see last year the early signs of some fraying at the edges of the government-to-government relationship. This year, I think we meet in more challenging circumstances. While the trade and investment relationship remains robust, the deterioration in the government-to-government relationship has the potential to undermine our business opportunities and certainly our future success. At the Australia-China Business Council, our core business is business. That's what we do. We work to increase the trade and investment relationship with China to the benefit of business and, of course, the broader Australian community. We leave politics to our elected parliamentarians. But I would be doing a disservice to our members and the feedback that they've provided over recent weeks, indeed over recent months, if I didn't call out the current challenges to the relationship. To put it bluntly, the relationship needs reset and repair to return to a position of mutual trust, of respect and friendship to the long-term benefit of both Australia and China. And to be clear, this doesn't mean compromising Australia's values or interests. The choice is not about whether to protect our national interest or engage more closely with China. Rather, it's about how to protect our national interest, which includes a positive relationship with China. One of the things that I've certainly learnt over the past 20 years or so, observing the development of the Australia-China relationship, is that many commentators and analysts all too often underestimate the growth and the sheer dynamism of the Chinese economy, as well as the huge benefits of this to the Australian economy and to our own living standards. Since the global financial crisis around a decade ago, China has accounted for almost 40% of all global GDP growth. And looking forward, the Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, recently pointed out a simple piece of arithmetic. China has 4 times the population of the US. That means that when Chinese per capita income reaches just half of that of the United States, their economy will be twice as big. At the ACBC, we look at the $183 billion of two-way trade between our countries as a great achievement, an achievement we can all be proud of. Our trade with China has significantly lifted Australian household incomes and living standards, and it's helped build some great Australian companies. But we also believe that if the Australia-China relationship can be reset on strong and positive terms, there are further gains to be had for both of our countries in the years and decades ahead. As China enters a new economic cycle, built much more around services, consumption, innovation and research and development, we see $183 billion as just the beginning, as the foundation for even more growth and opportunities in the future. And so just how significant are those opportunities? We'll be hearing about some of them in our panels today. But when President Xi Jinping made his keynote address to the APEC CEO Summit last November, he provided, I think, a compelling picture of the extraordinary trade and investment opportunities that China will generate over the next 15 years. And he said this, and I quote, "It's estimated that China will import US 24 trillion worth of goods, attract US 2 trillion of inbound investment, and make US 2 trillion of outbound investment." They're big numbers. 1 trillion is 1,000 billion. And these numbers, of course, are backed by other analysts. McKinsey's, who advise that China now has a massive 42% of global e-commerce, and Boston Consulting, who predict that by just 2020, more than 100 million Chinese households will have annual incomes in excess of 60,000 Australian dollars per annum. And these factors, of course, help explain why on Singles Day last year, Alibaba did more than US $25 billion worth of business in one day. And to put that in context, that's more business, more GDP than the whole of the Tasmanian economy in a whole year. The combined total for US Black Friday and Cyber Monday was under US $8 billion. So we believe that there are extraordinary opportunities for Australian exporters as well as for service providers. But we will need the relationship on a strong and positive footing if we are to maximise this potential. For our part, the Australia-China Business Council intends to take a leadership position in maintaining and building the Australia-China relationship. Over the next 6 to 9 months, we're going to push ahead with a range of initiatives that are designed to support and build and reinforce the relationship. In July in Darwin, we are hosting a large 2-day conference on the Belt and Road Initiative. We see BRI as a driver of growth in our region, generating new opportunities for Australian businesses, as well as lifting the living standards of less well-developed economies. And of course, it's worth noting that the area covered by BRI encompasses a population of 4.4 billion people, or 62.55% of the world's population, and represents around a third of global GDP. Secondly, ACBC will be actively supporting and participating in the China International Import Expo in Shanghai in November. We are delighted that Minister Chobo has committed to supporting and attending the CIIE, and we will be working with him as well as federal and state agencies to generate new business opportunities for our members. Thirdly, ACBC, in partnership with Auscham, will again be actively supporting the AFL and relevant AFL clubs for next year's Shanghai game. We will be building business events around the game, and we hope that next year a women's AFL game might also be played. We are firm believers in the power of sports diplomacy. And fourth, of course, over the next year through our ACBC state and territory branches, we will be organising around 100 seminars, events and functions to promote trade and investment, covering topics as diverse as health and aged care right through to dairy and horticulture. We'll also be supporting numerous outbound and inbound China trade and investment missions. And finally, of course, can I say last year, I know many of you were present at the event last year, we organised and hosted the Australia-China Economic and Trade Cooperation Forum, at which Premier Li Keqiang and Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull spoke. We would welcome the opportunity to work with government, to work with DFAT and other parties to host such a forum again in 2019. So, just in conclusion, this year, ladies and gentlemen, we celebrate, as you know, the 40th anniversary of China's opening up to the world. This extraordinary opening up, which has lifted hundreds of millions, 600 million people out of poverty, which has generated significant global GDP growth, and which has immeasurably lifted the living standards of Australians and Australian households. As Bill Gates recently put it, no other country has accomplished what China has achieved in the last few decades, breaking the relentless cycle of poverty and disease for hundreds of millions of people while modernising its economy at a scale and a speed unprecedented in human history. It's also worth noting that last year we celebrated the 45th anniversary of Australia-China diplomatic relations. That visionary decision taken by then Prime Minister Whitlam to recognise the People's Republic of China, followed of course by most other developed economies throughout the world and particularly President Nixon in the United States. But what all of this means is that Australia has been engaged with China at every stage of their growth journey. And by the way too, so has the Australia-China Business Council. At ACBC, we believe, as I said before, that this journey, this partnership, has only just begun, and that Australia and China still have much to gain from a strong and a positive partnership into the future. And that's why this event, that's why Canberra Networking Day is so important. It's why it's wonderful to see so many businesses and individuals who are here to support the Australia-China business relationship. And it's why we look forward also to working with you all to help generate new friendships and opportunities in the years ahead. Now, thank you. They are my remarks, and now it is my great pleasure to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Cheng, the Ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the Commonwealth of Australia. His Excellency started his post to Australia in 2016 after a distinguished diplomatic career which has included postings to the United Nations and to the international organisations in Geneva and Vienna. We are delighted this is the second Australia-China Business Council that the Ambassador has attended. We think it adds to the day to have the Ambassador speaking and Australian Government Ministers and Shadow Ministers speaking. We are also very grateful that the Ambassador and his team continue to put on the drinks and dinner tonight at the Embassy, which is always a high point of the day. I won't say it's the pinnacle of the day, Ambassador, because what happens here is the most important part, but the dinner is a very close second. We appreciate that. And the Ambassador's told me he has another very important engagement elsewhere tonight, so he won't be there, but of course his ministerial ambassadors and staff will be. So we're delighted to see you here again, Ambassador. Would you please welcome the Chinese Ambassador to Australia, Ambassador Cheng.
Thank you, John, for your kind words, and also for the remarks that you made just now. I can say I share almost everything you have said. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I have the great pleasure to be with you this morning for this year's ACBC Canberra Networking Day. I understand I found it has become more popular and got a lot more traction. It shows how important, the importance of this council. I would like to, although I think it's a little bit cold, but actually it makes me feel warm to see familiar faces, and especially people from the business circle who have been committed to a stronger China-Australia relations. So I would like to take this opportunity to express my deep appreciation to the ACBC President, John Brumby, and all the guests here today for your contributions to promoting cooperation between our two countries. You might know yesterday was a traditional Chinese festival, i.e. the Dragon Boat Festival. People across the country and overseas Chinese community celebrated the day with dragon boat racing and eating zongzi, or Chinese rice dumplings. The festival is to commemorate a well-known Chinese poet a patriotic poet, Qu Yuan, who lived over 2,000 years ago. His great patriotism and poems has become an integral part of Chinese heritage, inspiring the Chinese people over the years. Late April this year, I attended an event named Timor Going Global, held by Alibaba Australia in Sydney. At the event, a well-decorated dragon boat purchased on the Timor website was displayed at Coco Bay, Darling Harbour. It was really fantastic. As John just said, this year marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. Reform and opening up has both profoundly changed China and greatly influenced the world. The achievements in the past 4 decades are comprehensive. Not only miracles were created in China's economic development, with its GDP being averaged annual growth of around 9.5%, and more than 700 million people being lifted out of poverty. Huge progresses were also made across the political, social, and cultural areas, as well as the rule of law and human rights. Thus, we have blazing a path of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Meanwhile, reform and opening up has spurred on China's interaction and integration with the rest of the world. By actively embracing globalization, China has capitalized or drawn on overseas fund, market, technology, and management experiences, while kept expanding its business cooperation with other countries. So all this has helped boost China's development. And in other words, China's development has benefited a lot from the international community. On the other hand, reform and opening up has enabled China to make more contributions to the world. It has taken an active part in the UN peacekeeping operations, now standing as the largest troop contributor among the permanent 5. China has made its important share to the resolutions of regional or international conflicts and disputes, such as addressing the Iranian nuclear issue and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. China made significant contributions to mitigating the global financial crisis and has contributed over 30% of the global growth in recent years. China has firmly upheld the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, strongly supported multilateral trading systems and global governance on climate change. So with 40 years of reform and opening up, China has made tremendous advancement on its journey to modernization, but we still have a long way to go. Though China being the second largest economy, it remains a developing country. The 19th CPC Congress held last October drew a grand blueprint for China's future development. It is, as I understand, a 3-step strategy. By 2020, we will accomplish the task of building a moderately prosperous society in all respects. And by 2035, we will basically realize socialist modernization. And by the middle of this century, we will turn China into a great modern socialist country. Based on past experiences and in light of the future challenges, for China to realize the above-mentioned goals, we must adhere to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. We must stay on our own development path under the guidance of Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And we must keep reforming and opening up. Now, China, as we say, has entered a new era. In the future, we'll devote great energy to addressing imbalances and inadequacies in our development to meet the people's growing needs for a better life. To this end, we'll continue to advance reform across the board, which includes deepening the supply-side structure reform. And we'll follow the new development vision, paying more attention to the quality of the development rather than the speed of economic growth. Meanwhile, we'll fight 3 major battles, as we call it. The first one is to forestall or defuse major risks, especially to forestall systematic financial risks. The second is to carry our targeted poverty elevation. With more than 10 million people, rural people, to be poor rural people to be reduced this year. And the third one is to make further progress in addressing pollution and building what we call a beautiful China. So China in the future will make new ground in opening up on all fronts. At this year's Boa Forum for Asia Conference, President Xi Jinping emphasized that China's door of opening up will open even wider. We will significantly broaden market access, further opening up service industry, especially financial industries, services. We will create more attractive investment environment. We'll strengthen protection of intellectual property rights, and we'll take the initiative to expand imports. This November, China will host the first International Import Expo. We welcome Trade Minister Chobel, who will lead the Australian delegation to the event. We'll also look forward to more Australian business taking part in it, and appreciate the efforts that has been made by ACBC in this regard. Equally important, China will join efforts with other countries and international organizations in forwarding the Belt and Road Initiative. The initiative is aimed at mutual beneficial cooperation among countries through enhanced connectivity. The BRI is China's idea, but its opportunities and outcomes are going to benefit the rest of the world. The BRI is open, transparent, and inclusive. And as the President emphasized, China has no geopolitical calculations, doesn't seek exclusionary blocks or impose business deals on others. Since it was put forward 5 years ago, the initiative has been supported and participated in by increasing number of countries and international organizations. As long as all parties stick to the principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits, the BRI can be surely made into the broadest platform for international cooperation to the greater benefit of all our peoples. While pursuing our national development, the Chinese people will continue to work together with the rest of the world and make more contributions to humanity. We will unswervingly follow the path of peaceful development and actively develop global partnership. And we will firmly support multilateralism and take an active part in the global governance with a view to building a community with shared future for mankind. And as has been stressed repeatedly, no matter how much progress it has made in its development, China will not threaten anyone, attempt to overturn the existing international system, or seek any spheres of influence. China will stay as determined as ever to promote world peace, contribute to global prosperity, and uphold the international order. As I just mentioned, everyone present here supports and cares the future of China-Australian relationship. I understand this year's ACBC Networking Day is about strengthening people-to-people exchanges between our two nations, with a large focus on services. And trade in services requires deep relationship and mutual understanding, which I believe is very relevant at the current state of affairs of our relations. It is right to say that since we established diplomatic ties in 1972, and especially since the beginning of the new century, huge progress has been made in exchanges and cooperation in various areas between the two countries, against the expectation of many people. These progresses have not only robustly spurred economic growth on both countries, but also delivered real benefits and tangible benefits to the two peoples. Of course, the development of bilateral relations has not always been smooth. Sometimes there be clouds, even rain and wind. China and Australia are in the same region. Both our economies are highly complementary. We have many shared interests, and the potential future cooperation is huge, including trade in service. And we both stand for free trade and open economy. So there is no reason for us not to develop a better relationship with each other based on mutual benefit and mutual trust. Nowadays, countries are becoming increasingly interdependent. But populism and protectionism are on the rise. The new round of technological and industrial revolution has brought to human society with new opportunities. It has also presented unprecedented challenges as well. Staying open and inclusive, enhancing communication and mutual learning are in the trend of human development. I remember at the new Colombo Plan 2017 Scholarship Awards dinner in late 2016, a young recipient spoke of the need to build more bridges that connected people and less barriers that separated people. His remarks was quite impressive among the audience. And I also recall Foreign Minister Julia Bishop at that event also stressed the value of the connections, networks, friendships, and relationships made by the Australian undergraduates in their destination countries with the help of the new Colombo Plan. Last year, in her remarks at the same occasion here, Minister Bishop shared us with the story of ATN Huawei Seas for the Future project. Under that program, 75 new Colombo Plan students will have the chance to work in Huawei's world-class R&D and manufacturing facilities starting late last year as interns. Recently, in his meeting with Minister Bishop, the Chinese State Councillor, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi outlined China's development path and its visions on developing relations with other countries. He pointed out that China follows a development path, follows a development path that is completely different from that of traditional major powers. China never interferes in the internal affairs of other countries, let alone carry out the so-called infiltration of other countries. China's idea is to carry out equal cooperation with all countries, including Australia, to achieve mutual benefit and win-win outcomes. He also expressed China's willingness to communicate with Australia on how to practically improve bilateral relations. It is my belief that in order to dispel the clouds and achieve sustained and sound development in our bilateral relations, the two countries need to have more interaction and inclusiveness with less bias or bigotry. We need to see each other's development and policy intentions from a more positive perspective with less Cold War mentality. We need to build more mutual trust with less misunderstanding. We need to develop more connections between our two countries and two peoples with less barriers. And we need to respect each other's core interests and major concerns while managing the differences in a constructive manner. A business circle is a major force that promotes our bilateral relations. And I hope and believe your discussions today will help deepen the practical cooperation and enhance political mutual trust between the two sides. Finally, as you said just now, although I couldn't make it, but I look forward and welcome all of you here to the embassy this evening for the traditional event. I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much to His Excellency the Ambassador, and I think it's going to be a fantastic day today, and we're going to hear a number of vitally important presentations. And Ambassador, I noted you were reading your speech in English, and presumably that's available if people want that, because I think it set out many elements of the relationship which are so fundamental to the Australia-China relationship. And just a couple of things which really jumped out for me. The Ambassador said that 45 years, this relationship has grown and prospered, and the friendship has grown, Ambassador, as you said, against the expectations of many people, and it has. There have been many who said this relationship would never work, but it's succeeded in an extraordinarily successful way. And I think secondly, too, if I could, China's position on openness, free trade, and opposing protectionism, something shared passionately by the Australia-China Business Council. It's why we were such strong supporters of the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement negotiated by the government. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for your speech today. Now, we'll move into the first of the panel sessions, if we could. To those of you who haven't been to one of these before, I know many have, as I've described it, it's a bit like, it's a busy day. It moves pretty rapidly. As someone said, it's a bit like speed dating. Not that I've ever done any speed dating, but it moves pretty quickly through the day. So our first session is Lee Featherby, who is I'm going to hand over to Lee, who is the CEO of Powerful Points. He's going to moderate our first panel session, which is on digital disruption, e-commerce and digital marketing. Lee, as you know, has been with us previously. He began working with presentations more than 30 years ago. 2003, he founded Powerful Points, specifically to address what he saw as a strong need for organisations to improve their presentations. And since then, he's designed for presentations for some of the world's most prestigious companies, Visa, Coca-Cola, GE, Microsoft and many others. He started creating presentations for Chinese audiences in 2013. Powerful Points created the crew induction video in Mandarin for McDonald's China and worked with both Australia and Chinese companies in the creation of presentations and videos in both languages. In 2015, Powerful Points established an office in Shanghai to provide a local presence to both large and small companies wanting to tell their stories to both Chinese and Australian audiences. So, Lee, over to you to introduce the panel.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real privilege to have this particular panel to moderate today because it's such an exciting area in China. For people who haven't been to China, and that's no one in this room obviously, it's very hard for them to understand how pervasive and how ubiquitous e-commerce is in the Chinese environment. I also had the privilege of going to Hangzhou a couple of years ago and seeing the level of support that's given to industries by the government in particular to develop that particular market and that particular segment, not only to service the Chinese market, but also for the opportunities it presents globally. So to be able to work with you today on this panel is actually quite a privilege. So I'd like to introduce, if I may, the speakers. I'll introduce you all, gentlemen. Welcome. And then perhaps we'll move around the panel and give each of you a couple of minutes, 5 minutes, to talk about your particular view on e-commerce disruption or digital disruption in China and that of your organisation, and how you think that's going to impact the Chinese market in the future and the Australian market in the future, and what opportunities it presents. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you. Andrew is the Executive General Manager of Australia Post International Services. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through everybody's background. It's in the document here, but it's well worth reading. They're all esteemed and very experienced people in this. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you, if I may.
Thank you, Lee, and good morning, everybody. So a little bit about Australia Post to start with. So we're actually Australia's oldest continuously operating business enterprise with a history of 209 years of continuous operation. Last year, the organisation delivered over 4 billion items to 11.7 million Australian addresses. So we're in everybody's street, in the letterboxes, in businesses, every single day of the year. Australian online shopping, some of you may have seen a report that Australia Post released about two weeks ago now, which was on Australian online shopping. Online shopping in Australia reached, and just keep these numbers in mind when you listen to John and James Hudson will probably elaborate a bit more on this in a moment, but just hold these numbers in your mind. In Australia, online shopping was $21 billion last year, so that's Australian dollars. That's a tremendous growth over the previous year. It was 19% growth. 80% of that was domestic purchases. About 8% of the gross sales occurred online in Australia, so in a retail environment where about 8% of our shopping happens online, and about 1 in 5 Australians shop using a mobile device. So just like you to just hold those numbers in your mind when you contrast with what James tells you about China in a moment. So parcel volumes in Australia are increasing quite rapidly, over 10% per annum. Interestingly, our inbound volumes, though, are growing over 40%, and the vast majority of these volumes are coming from China. We have a joint venture with China Post, which is 12 years old. So the business in China is called Cheng. We have 12 warehouses in different cities, 9 of them in bonded zones, and access to about 13 different gateways in China as well. So a tremendous resource for Australian companies that are wanting to access China. John spoke a few moments ago about the extraordinary growth in the middle class in China, and so I won't go back over the statistics, and all of us have heard different presentations of the same theme, but I think it's pretty fair to say that there's really very little in Australia's economic future that compares with the potential that the middle class in China presents to Australia. And so how well Australian companies do in getting at that and meeting that market, I think will very much determine just how well Australia does in the coming decades. Chinese consumers love Australia. They like Australian products. They offer a lifestyle aspiration for Australia. They're also, of course, clean, green, safe and fresh. And that's an extraordinarily important value that Australia brings. But it is not a market that you can take for granted. There's huge amount of competition. It's a very, very fast-moving market. Many countries are actively pursuing free trade agreements with China at the moment, and certainly they look at the Australian Free Trade Agreement as being a benchmark to aspire to. The consumers in China are also very demanding. As I said before, a competitive market. It's fast-moving, technologically enabled market, and the consumers demand quality and they demand speed. So for any Australian company thinking about accessing the China market, understanding the competitive dynamic and just how fast-moving that market is extraordinarily important. And it's not just as simple, and James, forgive me for saying this, it's not just as simple as putting your product on Tmall. You do have to understand what is your right to win. As I said before, there are many international companies as well as domestic companies competing for the business in China. So just putting your brand on a website doesn't get you there. You have to understand how Chinese consumers buy. You need to understand the Daigou market. You need to understand the KOLs. And you have to have an online presence. Blogs and content are critical in getting to the Chinese consumers. Working out what is going to be your distribution model. And if you are successful, how are you going to finance that? And do you have the facilities and capacity and ability to meet the demand that may come if your product becomes successful? The last thing that I would like to say, and I know we'll have plenty of time to expand on some of these ideas in the panel, is don't bet the house on the China market. If you're a small business, like any business, you do have to have multiple customers and multiple streams, so you can't just put all of your business dependent on the China market.
Thank you, Andrew. James, you're probably the most well-known person on this panel. I think everybody in this room is probably familiar with your time as CEO of ACBC.
I was going to say, it's nice to be on this side this year.
So it's very good to have you here and representing probably certainly China's largest e-commerce organisation. We're really looking forward to what you have to say in this area.
Great. Well, no, thank you very much. And look, it's a real pleasure to be here, and congratulations to the ACBC and Helen for organising another really great Canberra Networking Day. So maybe talking a little bit about Alibaba Group. We don't have 209 years of history, but we have 18. We were founded by Jack Ma and 17 co-founders in 1999 in his Hangzhou apartment. And Jack really founded Alibaba with a very simple mission, and that mission is to make it easy to do business anywhere. And remarkably, over these 18 years, despite the many changes and evolution of Alibaba, that mission has always stayed really fundamental to the business, to support millions of small businesses around the world and connect them to opportunities utilising the technology that the internet provides us. So today, Alibaba Group is what we call an e-commerce ecosystem. We have businesses including marketplaces like Tmall, Taobao, Alibaba.com, digital entertainment businesses like Youku, a stake in Weibo. We have local services, Fliggy, a travel booking platform in China, but also the fundamental infrastructure to help those businesses across payments with Alipay, Alibaba Cloud, providing cloud and technological solutions, Cainiao in the logistics space. So all of this kind of works together in one really seamless ecosystem where we can provide the infrastructure to businesses to really take advantage of those opportunities. So today, Alibaba, we have 617 million mobile monthly active users. So they're users in China who log on to an Alibaba retail app in China at least once a month. And we deliver through our network with Cainiao around 50 million packages a day. So it's kind of hard to get your head around the volume there. We run a lot of different promotions like Singles Day or the Double 11 Shopping Festival. Last year we sold $24.3 billion in US in gross merchandise volume, as mentioned by John, generating around 650 million parcels. So really the e-commerce landscape is kind of synonymous to retail in China. It makes up about 20% of total retail. I know, Andrew, you mentioned in Australia it's around 8%. 8. But that's also growing quickly. Now, the opportunity for Australian businesses, we opened our office in February last year, and we have a local team on the ground here. And what we're really focused on doing is helping Australian businesses access the China market. So 12 months ago, we had 1,300 Australian brands selling through Tmall and Tmall Global, our B2C marketplaces. We now have over 2,000 Australian brands selling through those marketplaces. And Australia has also gone from the 5th highest country to the 3rd highest country over the last 2 years in terms of exports. So I think Australia is doing pretty well, and I think we're punching above our weight. One really important thing to acknowledge is the really fundamental role that the Chinese Australian community and Chinese students have played in building these brands into China. A lot of these brands wouldn't be where they are today without the work and the efforts that the Chinese migrant community here in Australia have really taken to build those brands. The other opportunity that we're focused on in Australia is working with the tourism retail sector. Alipay, our payment platform, is now accepted by about 11,000 retailers here in Australia, and that also provides a great opportunity for those tourism retailers to not only offer the payment method of choice but also market through the platform. So they're really two of our core focuses here in this market. Touching on just 3 trends that I see across Alibaba and how this online retail market environment is changing and the opportunities for Australian businesses. The first is the emergence of a trend called new retail. So as we mentioned, 20% of retail in China is online, 80% is offline. But it's that boundary in China that's really being blurred. There's always been a clear distinction around what's online and what's offline. But really China, and with Alibaba leading the way, is really changing the way in which retail works. So an example is the Hema supermarkets. We have opened 48 new retail supermarkets in China with another 1,000 to open over the next 5 years. 60% of the sales are on the app and pick and packed in the store and sent half an hour delivery within a 3-kilometre radius, and the other 40% are in store. So keeping that new retail environment in mind. The second trend is young people, people born after 1990. BCG called this a consumer group that you cannot ignore and possibly the most important in the world. And this after 1990 or 90后 consumer group, they're experimental, they're richer than their parents, they want to try new products, they want to travel, they want to really kind of live life in a very, very different way to how their parents do. And that's really driving a lot of change as well. The third and final group is women, female consumers. They make up over 60% of the consumers on Alibaba's retail marketplaces, and they're also driving a lot of trends. One of the big surprises in Australia this year is the growth of Australian fashion selling through Tmall, particularly in swimwear, activewear, those types of categories. And it's really those female consumers that are really driving a lot of change and a lot of shifts in the way that the product categories that consumers demand. So I might leave it there, but they're kind of 3 insights I wanted to touch on, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. David Hazlehurst, Deputy CEO and Partnership Support at Austrade. What is the government saying from an Australian perspective around digital disruption and e-commerce in China?
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here this morning. Two very impressive speakers to follow after, and I'd echo a lot of their comments. Austrade, of course, is the Australian government's trade and investment promotion organisation with 80 points of presence across the world. And our biggest presence, of course, outside Australia is in China. Perhaps I might just take one brief step backwards before then going forwards and say, notwithstanding the ambassador's remarks about China still being a developing country, you don't need to go much further than China to see what the fourth industrial revolution looks like. And what Austrade is seeing in our engagement with China, with businesses in Australia engaging with China and with Chinese investors as well, is just explosive growth and interest and appetite in areas of technology. So whilst it's very true and important to reflect on the opportunities for Australia in relation to our raw materials, in relation to food and agriculture, less is often said about the thirst and excitement in China for collaboration and investment around fintech, medtech, agtech, biotech, food tech. And that's certainly an enormous focus for an organisation like ours. When Austrade thinks about engaging with a lot of the trends to do with e-commerce, we're actually looking to partner very closely with others who are directly engaged. So whether it's Australia Post or Alibaba or others who are keenly engaged, Austrade, of course, does not want to set up its own digital platforms for e-commerce, but rather to facilitate business acting in its own interests to engage. A couple of observations I would make, though. In addition to the excellent points that made by previous speakers about really deeply understanding the Chinese consumer, recognising that it's a highly, highly, highly competitive market in China. One of the observations we'd also make is just the critical importance of going to where the consumers are. And it's easy to underestimate from Australia the pervasive nature of a platform like WeChat. Be very familiar to everyone in this room, but it's easy for Australian businesses to misunderstand just how pervasive and how important it is to have a presence through those digital platforms as well. So a lot of our marketing and promotion and support that Austrade is engaged with and supporting Australian businesses is through exploring, connecting with where Chinese consumers are, and many, many, many of them are in WeChat itself. The other observation I'd make is that when Austrade is engaging with others, we're potentially looking to deepen the direct links that we can make for businesses into the channels themselves. But very often they need to make a lot of choices and do a lot of preparation beforehand. As I think Andrew was pointing out, it's not as straightforward as simply getting onto one of the platforms. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before that. I might pause there but engage in the discussion as it evolves.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to introduce Nigel Stitt, Head of Sales, Australia and New Zealand, Global Enterprise Services International for Telstra. Definitely someone who's got a lot at stake in this market, Nigel.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Can everyone hear me? I think this is on. Hello? I might borrow yours if you don't mind, David. Okay. Look, good morning, and look, very nice to be here. This is our, I think, Helen, this is our third year of our active involvement in the ACBC, and I guess to define of why Telstra is here. I mean, if we look back again, maybe to borrow a point from James, we don't have a 200-so-year history in China, but we're certainly, when Telstra first ventured into the China market was over 30 years ago. I guess it got more pointed when we established our first office in Beijing 20 years ago, and if we look at what our business is to a day, we operate over across 20 provinces and over 31 cities across China. We've got over 200 staff on the ground there across a range of roles, from service to account management to engineering. And we are the only, I believe, the only, or certainly the largest foreign-owned IPVPN and network provider in the Chinese marketplace. And that's really allowed us to, particularly I would say over the past 10 years, is really be a gateway for Australian organisations who want to establish themselves in China and really help underpin the digital platforms that are becoming more and more relevant in the marketplace in order for businesses to be successful. Look, I guess we haven't, I guess, to be successful, we've also learnt a lot of lessons along the way to grow our the business there. And if I look at, we wouldn't have been successful if it wasn't without a long-term commitment to the market, a very good understanding that partnerships, both at an enterprise and a government level, are absolutely important for you to be successful there, and have a lot of patience and back it with a good degree of investment as well. And that's really allowed us to grow our business there. Look, a couple of comments on what we are seeing, and maybe you'll echo some of the comments that have been said here. Look, if you look at a few things, if you look at the absolute growth around the e-commerce, we've got from BMI Research has shown us, and we're certainly experiencing, is that e-commerce is growing at about 19% compound growth per annum. That's extremely fast. And what we've found is that outside of not just Chinese consumer behaviour, but business behaviour, an absolute thirst for connectivity and digital platforms. If we look at some of the, I guess if you look at some of what, being in a technology business, we look at, IP traffic, and therefore that defines just the use of digital platforms. And you look at the growth around IP, that's growing at 26% per annum. That's enormous growth. And if you actually look inside it, you actually see, if you look at IP video, that's growing at about 29% per year. Got online gaming growing at 36% per year. And then more importantly, we're seeing business IEP traffic continue to grow. Our statistics shows that's growing at 21% per year. So if you match the growth around e-commerce and the thirst for mobility and for connectivity, and if you match it with that, I guess that raw IP traffic growth and those trends, it's just the numbers are just mind-boggling in terms of the opportunity that it can present itself. The other point that we would say is that I would say you absolutely have to have a digital strategy, regardless what your business is going into China. We would also counsel on that it can't just be one strategy. It needs to be multifaceted in its approach. And I think the other thing last year we launched a piece of research called Connecting Commerce, where we actually went out and researched over 2,500 executives across 45 cities globally, and we really looked at the trend between digitalisation and ICT maturity around those platforms in cities, and how that linked to how businesses saw their opportunities to actually leverage it. Out of the 45 cities, it was interesting to see that in the top 50% were the 5 major cities in China. Were in terms of their confidence, that businesses associated there, that they've had a real confidence in the available around, obviously, the investment from the country around raw technology platforms. But come back to my point around having a multiple digital strategy, is that if you look out into the Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, you can't just assume that the same strategy, the same digital platform is going to work in the same way. So our advice there is to really do your research, and I'm assuming we're going to hear from this panel, is that often I hear Australian firms saying we just got to capture 1% of the market and we're going to be okay. But I'd also warn that capturing 1% is not easy either, unless you get your strategy right. And to also think about that it's not just about the major cities. Competition is fierce there, that often there are good opportunities down at Tier 2 and Tier 3 locations within China. And a Tier 2 and a Tier 3 city in China doesn't mean it's a Tier 2 and Tier 3 business opportunity for us, for Australian organisations. The thing that we have learned again, having good partners, investing in those partners who can provide the right building blocks for you, are absolutely critical to be able to execute on a successful China strategy. So I might pause there and hand it back to you, Lee.
Thanks, Nigel. You've actually raised a very good point, and that is if you speak to traditional businesses about their experience in China, they say don't try and attack the China market in one giant hit. In actual fact, target particular cities or particular regions and develop from there rather than trying to stretch your resources. Would you recommend the same strategy from a digital perspective to maximise entry into, Shanghai or Beijing are all bigger than Australia anyway, or do you think that digital negates that to some degree?
There's not really a sort of every size or one size fits all answer to that question. I mean, the reality is that digital opens up for everybody. So, James made the point about the online offline strategy as well. So the other thing you have to think about, of course, is your own internal resources as well. I mean, there are I would argue, not many Australian companies actually that have the resources, if there are any Australian companies that have the resources to tackle the entire China market in one go. But it is about, step by step, and it really depends on the product that you're offering. But understanding who your target customer is and what it is that they want to buy and why they buy and how they buy is really important. I come back to my point before about understanding how Chinese consumers buy. Your best friends here are the Daigou and the key opinion leaders. They will tell you whether your product has any resonance with the consumers in China or not. So you can do that before you take the risk of stepping outside of Australia.
Mm-hmm. Just to kind of go on from that point, I think Australia is so lucky to have such a strong Chinese migrant community, and I think before even going to China, they really should be looking at that migrant community first and getting feedback on their packaging, their product taste and feel, and all the different aspects that are going to make them successful in China, and utilising that network to really start growing their brand. And that's for most small businesses, they start off with our Taobao platform when they work with Alibaba, and they work with a network of Taobao buyers who can work with them to help refine their product offering and their brand and their messaging. So I definitely agree that that's a good place to start for a lot of small businesses too.
And maybe if I can just add a point, one thing that we've seen, particularly looking at some of our customers' successful growth in China, is that a good digital strategy can then lead to a very relevant bricks and mortar strategy as well. Rather than thinking, traditionally a lot of people think bricks and mortar, then I go digital. I think the opportunity is the other way around, and I think there's still certainly just looking at our customers, certainly a good need to also consider how does that digital strategy allow you to grow your brand through a bricks and mortar approach.
Okay, excellent. Do you have anything else to add? Is it necessary? Digital is such a broad field, and so many different things can be delivered via that medium. Is it necessary for a long-term effective strategy to have feet on the ground in China when you're embarking on a digital strategy?
I think eventually, if you're successful, you will, but I don't think it means that you need to do that from the beginning. And that's one of the beauties, I think, of the technology platform. As James said, and I can't emphasise this enough, you've actually got to have a market here in Australia for your product. It's not about, very rare that you're taking a product to China and suddenly that becomes the market. I mean, the Chinese consumer are buying the products that are being used here in Australia, and as James said, products which are being recommended by the Chinese consumers who are already here in Australia. They're recommending them back. We see many businesses, the business models are evolving. If you look at the early days of the vitamin distribution, so Blackmores, for example, where my CEO Christine comes from, it was very much about the cross-border business. It was going through the cross-border marketplaces. Of course, the local Daigous were buying and sending those products back. But now Blackmores, and this is true of many other brands, are establishing their own footholds in China. So it is about a multi-channel market. Online, offline, many of the consumers, in fact there's probably more consumers in this room who know a whole lot more about this than me, but the Chinese consumers are looking at lots of different points of reference. They check your website, they look at blogs, they look for recommendations, they're talking to their friends on social media. So they want to see that you have a presence. They may go eventually buy on one of the marketplaces, Alibaba's marketplace or others, but they want to see that physical presence. This is why at Australia Post we've opened our flagship store in Chatswood. So we have an online and offline strategy as well, and eventually that will translate into presence in China. Indeed, we have that through our joint venture partner. But if we're successful with this plan, then I expect that we'll see a whole lot more Australia Post people in China as well.
Please, David.
Lee, I would just only add to Andrew's comments and state the obvious, which is that for many Australian businesses, you don't get China until you're there. And I know it's an obvious point, but to really understand the Chinese consumer, I think it helps to actually be there.
I agree.
And the differences between regions and cities, they are different, and understanding the different trends that are occurring and the different consumer tastes that are present in different cities will help businesses find where their niche might be as well. But also just to deeply understand how fiercely competitive it is there. So whilst it might not be that a presence is needed in a sort of ongoing bricks and mortar sense, although it clearly can be extremely helpful as well, it's very easy to downplay the need to actually get over there and more deeply understand the market into which you're selling.
Yeah. If you're not there full time, spend.
Yep, sure.
If I
Nigel.
could just add a couple of points. The first point is, and again, I'm not a digital marketer, so I'm not an expert here, but certainly what I've learnt is that don't make the mistake of assuming how you market your product to an Australian audience will just translate to how the Chinese consumer likes to see and buy their product. I think you need to be very, very smart and seek out advice and partnerships on how to change the look and feel of your website and right down to colours and animation and how people buy it. I think that's just a comment and an uneducated one maybe, because that's not my area of expertise. But I also just want to point out too that we're talking a lot here about people using e-commerce sites. Don't forget we've got a lot of businesses going into China who have professional services organisations and they actually need to, and they've got a slightly different need. They need to establish a presence. They need to be very conscious around data sovereignty laws. You need to be very, very conscious in terms of how you can move data in and out of the country on a digital level. So we're talking very much here about consumer and marketing, but there is also another whole other demand of, as I said, professional services businesses going into China, and that brings with it a whole lot of other considerations, particularly around cloud technologies and technology platforms that again drives a need to make sure that you've got the right advice and you've got the right partners to help you lay the right foundations there.
Okay, thank you. So I'd now like to open up to the audience if you have any particular questions that you would like to ask our panellists. Not all at once. Yes, please. I think we'll bring a microphone to you. So, yep. So when you stand up, please introduce yourself and your company, and if your question is to a particular panellist or to the panel in general.
Okay, my name's George Pasuto, a company called Global Media Solutions. So we do a lot of work with a lot of digital media and all media, in fact, mainly China and to Chinese here. So this is more a comment, but I invite your response to it as well. I think one of the most important things that we've talked about here is the need for a digital strategy, and that it can't just be all eggs in one basket. So we get a lot of discussion around going in on WeChat or going in on KOLs and banner ads and whatever it might be, or Weibo or whatever it might be, but there's a certain level of evolution that companies need to go through. And if you're a company in China doing lots of marketing, spending $500 million on advertising, you're not just going to be using WeChat. In fact, you're going to be using the second tiers and third tier apps in China as well, even though WeChat, 1 billion monthly active users. So there are choices, and if you're in China, you're not going to be using WeChat because it's too expensive. It might be the best platform, but it's too expensive. So just that comment about how intricate it may be and how that evolution needs to evolve. And having a presence there is still really important because we find the deal gets done when we're face to face. So you do need to get there, even if you're not going to set up an office. So I think that echoes what you're saying, but if you want to expand on that, it'd be great.
Comments, gentlemen?
Well, again, I think it's not one size fits all. I mean, if you're clearly if you're a multinational company with a multi-million-dollar marketing budget, then your ability and capacity is quite different to your average Australian small business. I think one of the things which is really important. I mean, we were just last week with a customer, and it was pretty. This is a company that sells to their product, hair care products, actually, to about 80 different countries, but China is not yet one of them, but they would like to get into China. And it was probably 5 minutes into the discussion that it became really obvious that the consultant that they were using had no idea what they were advising them about. So they had a website that was offshore, so it wasn't a .cn website, in China, and they couldn't understand why they were not getting any sales on it. So it was really important that, and there's a lot of people out there offering advice. It's really important that you get good advice. If your budget is relatively small, then clearly you have to cut your cloth according to that. Maybe there's a question about whether China's actually even a market you should be in if you can't afford to market to it.
Maybe I can just add to that from our experience. I believe fully, yes, you have to be there. And if we look at, we wouldn't have been successful as Telstra in that market if we hadn't had that local presence and a team on the ground to stay close to the opportunities and the partnerships that we want to build. As our business has matured there, we've also made a absolute move to employ local talent. And that's been absolutely critical to our success as well, and not just fly various Western leaders in to run the business. So we've been very, very conscious around that as well. And I think it's that the need to build partnerships and to understand what's going on in the ground, and again looking at the multiple of different markets there. That I don't think our advice, you can't just do it remotely. And I'm sure everyone agrees, not just one trip into China. I think it takes many, many trips. And I think someone said on the panel, Australian businesses just don't get it sometimes until you're actually there multiple times. So I would agree, presence is critical.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
Hi, Ophelia Liang here, co-founder of Digital Crew. We've been helping a lot of Australian business marketing digitally into China for the past 5 years. We also have offices in Guangzhou and 7 other locations in the world. Now, in the past 5 years, we've been working with a lot of Australian business, medium to large enterprise. And what we notice is there is a big gap between the knowledge of what China is and what we think China is from here. So a very practical question is, a lot of brands, no matter big or small, come to us or other provider in the room with a moderate or good budget, but have sky-high expectations. And what is your experience on this, and how do you think we should work together to address this? To all panelists.
James?
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more, Ophelia, that there is a gap in the market around how people perceive China, and particularly with e-commerce, I think that there's a little bit of a perception that it's a get-rich-quick scheme, and it's really not. It really is a huge amount of work and effort. And if you ask, as Christine Holgate said when she was at Blackmores, it took Blackmores 20 years to become an overnight success. So for us, we're really focused on running a lot of training workshops with those businesses to educate them on what the real opportunity is and how it's accessed, but also resetting and recalibrating expectations that their own businesses would have taken some time to become profitable and sustainable, and starting a new operation in China is really no different to that. So I think all the players in the market really have a responsibility to make sure that we're educating and informing people so they do have the right level of expectation there.
If you do think China is a get-rich-quick scheme, could you put your hand up, please? Because I think you're in the wrong room.
Not this.
Could I just maybe just add a point there? Because we touched on technology before, and this is kind of relevant to that point as well. I mean, there's a lot of discussion, and you read much about China being a copycat. Well, in this area of e-commerce, regardless of the arguments on the other fronts, China is absolutely leading the world. And if you look at automation, artificial intelligence, payment systems, your average Australian can't imagine how far in advance China is. And so the idea that you can just kind of go into China with your good old Australian product and your good old Australian system and be successful is a recipe for disaster. And I'm sure James will have seen this. We've seen it, the companies that come to us and say, can you help us get into the China market, this kind of get-rich-quick scheme, and they have nothing in terms of the back office and the support, the social media presence that is going to be required to be successful.
Thank you. There was a lady down there.
Yep. Hi. My name's Victoria Cuter. I'm from Edutech Schools. We deliver the ACT Senior Secondary Certificate in China. We have a physical presence in China and our flagship school's in Shanghai. We're having a very active conversation at the moment about bringing some of our content online, and I'd love to hear your tips about, from an education provider's perspective, I guess, into how to do that, and just your thoughts around that.
Who'd like to start?
Maybe Victoria, good question. Look, I think things to consider from a digital platform in a practical sense, not talking about content, is you need to think about a good, reliable network to allow you to achieve that. You need to consider things like hosting, like where does the actual content and data live. You need to think about the end user's experience in terms of the performance that they get in using that content, and that all will play into both everything from costs and to practicalities of where that data may live. And need to also think about intellectual property and the security and the access to that data. It's mostly something that we'd be happy to talk to you with, and it's mostly quite a long conversation as opposed to answering on the panel. But there'll be some of the practical things we would revise, and again, partnerships with the right people to help you answer some of those questions would be key. But if it's relevant, happy to talk to you longer about it after this panel.
Yeah, great question. And I'm sure you're doing this already, but one really obvious point is being really thoughtful about who your target market is. So there's all the comments around the marketing side of things, but obviously if your business model is to put content online and to be then effectively delivering education services into China, you've got to really deeply understand education in China. So I'm sure you're doing that, but a little bit like some of the comments before about Australian businesses or institutions assuming that what will work here will work there, deeply engaging with local partners to think through how your content will work in the Chinese market will be critical. Yeah.
Another point on that, just Alibaba doesn't really do anything in the education space, but another thing to think about is how your target audience consumes that content, because you'll find that they're not sitting at a laptop or a desktop computer. It's very mobile. Often it's very gamified with lots of animations and games and, jumping animated animals and things. So really have a think about how that content is designed and how it's consumed in China as well.
It's an extremely competitive market in China, the education sector.
It's very competitive.
All the major institutions, not only in Australia but globally, have very strong presence in China.
Yeah, I mean, just pick up that point again. In my comments, I talked about in Australia 1 in 5 online purchases occurs using a mobile device. But James, in China, the number is more like 90%.
So I know that 90% of the gross merchandise volume on our platforms is through a mobile device in China. So,
So I mean, this is not an education-specific comment, but just more broadly, is again to my point about technology, there's a massive difference.
Okay, one last question before we wrap it up. Please.
Oh, thank you. My name is Jason. I'm from ANZ. Obviously, I think most of people know ANZ is the largest Australian bank in China, and so we were in China back in the 80s. So a lot of lesson learned experience that we can share later on to anyone who's interested. But my question to the panelists is, I think we talked a lot about using digital marketing, e-commerce on goods merchandise to China. But we haven't touched on services. I'm sure there's a lot of technology, disruptive technology developing in the world now to make it very easy to transfer that service or, doing services through that. Just be interested in, your views on, what you see in the services side of the equation. Thanks.
Well, I mean, look, from an Australia Post perspective, we've got a digital identity product, which is really important if you're transacting on a website, e-commerce site. Knowing who those consumers are. We're working with some Australian brands at the moment who are concerned about where their product is going and who is buying it. So using our digital identity services is critical. There's also, of course, the whole issue of payments. I spoke before about mobile and mobile payments. If you're selling something on an e-commerce platform, then you need to get paid, and how you get paid and the convenience for a Chinese consumer of using their existing payment platforms like Alipay, WeChat Pay, etc. So from Australia Post, we're more about the physical world, but there are aspects of e-commerce where we do have some quite important services. But it's perhaps James and David, from an online view.
Maybe just make one really specific point. From the general to the specific. So the general point is, as has been discussed across the e-commerce side of things, the competition is very, very fierce around services in China. And particularly if we're talking about, in particular, sort of services that are technology-based, one of the things that Austrade's exploring quite actively is thinking about ways of engaging that are a little different for Australian businesses. So the idea of an Australian business, if you like, having a finished product in the form of a service that it would take to China and just be able to sell into the China market is really tough, because the competition is so tough in China. But one thing we are exploring is thinking through, for example, are there multinationals in China who have technology problems that they want to fix? And is there an opportunity for us to work as Austrade, for example, with some of those multinationals to say, tell us some of the innovation that you're looking for, and can we reach back into Australia and find that capability, potentially in startups or scale-ups, where actually what then is sold into China as the service may be actually part of the back end, or part of a service, a technology service, rather than necessarily the whole solution. So some of the models that people will need to engage with around services, not necessarily thinking they're going to have a fully worked up solution in Australia that they'll just take to China, but rather thinking a bit more creatively about, in effect, being part of the supply chain into businesses in China who actually deeply understand the Chinese market and are already fiercely competing in that market for customers.
Okay, so thank you, gentlemen, for your very valuable contribution today. It's been greatly appreciated. I'd like to probably summarise the main points we covered today. And firstly is, don't go in as an arrogant Australian, thinking that you have the product, you sell it here, it's going to be successful in China. You need to adjust it and be very sensitive to the market and the way the consumers buy and their expectations there. One of the ways to do that is to begin working with the Chinese community here to get an understanding of how your product will be accepted. Get good advice and local understanding, and look for opportunities outside T1 and T2 initially in the early stages as well. And finally, don't look at China as a get-rich-quick scheme, because it's obviously not that, as anyone in this room will tell you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your day. Back to you, John.
Well, thank you very much to Lee and to the panel. I thought that was a great session. What I'm most interested in, James Hudson, is how I can get the deliveries from the supermarket within 3 kilometres in 30 minutes. I thought that was pretty good. But I think that's going to be a few years coming in Australia. Now, so thank you for the panel. We're breaking for morning tea. We've got half an hour for morning tea. Straight after morning tea, we've got Jason Clare, the Shadow Minister for Trade and Northern Development. Then we have a fantastic panel on education, and then we have Shadow Minister Penny Wong. So it's quite a full session between morning tea, so we'll start, and lunch, so we'll start at 11 a.m. sharp. Thank you.